It's a real pleasure to be here today, talking about building APIs in Nuxt. And we're going to do this just as simply as possible, looking at some of what Nuxt can do and getting dirty in the code directly. So to get started, you'll probably want to have a Nuxt application ready to go. So we'll just create a new one. We'll call it Treblle Hacktoberfest and get going. Nuxt will give us an option for a package manager. We pretty much support anything that you might want to do, but we'll get started with PNPM to begin with. I'm a big fan. Once you have your Nuxt app up and running, then we can just open it in your editor of choice. And you'll see out of the box there are just a couple of files. So you'll have your app, which just contains a welcome component. Your Nuxt config file, which enables DevTools for you. And then you'll see we also have a server folder, and that's where a lot of what we're going to be doing today is going to be located. That's actually running in the Nitro context of your app. Nuxt uses a server called Nitro. You can find out a little bit more about it at nitro.njs.io. It's a very powerful framework for building web servers. We built it as part of Nuxt and then extracted it. So it's now a standalone framework that can be used and is used by other frameworks and can be used just purely on its own. It contains a lot of great features that I love, like type safety end-to-end. It contains things like being able to deploy to lots and lots of different server targets. Here are some of the providers we support out of the box. And in many cases with zero config. And it, of course, powers Nuxt. So we're using that under the head in our project today. If you're getting started with Nuxt, you'll probably want to start the dev server to begin with. And of course, we should see that we've got our Nuxt welcome component being rendered here by default. If you want to create a server root, an API root with Nuxt, it's pretty straightforward. You do it by creating a file in the server directory. So we support two kinds of endpoints. You can have an API endpoint here. So we could create API foo. And we just basically export an event handler and you return a value. That can be a direct JSON value, for example. So in this case, we'll just return foo. If I were to fire open my terminal and quickly request that endpoint, API foo, we actually directly get that JSON back. Nuxt knows because it's an object that it should be JSON, and it sets the content type correctly for us. If we return something else, so for example, if we return div hi, that is going to automatically be turned into HTML. So you can see that that's what's coming back from the server. So Nitro makes it very easy to get started, and any file in that server API directory is going to become a path with the same sort of pattern. So if I wanted, for example, to make this auth login, then I just create a folder, auth login, and then I just hit auth login, and that is the root that's going to come back to me. Maybe instead I want to have something like a user with an ID. In that case, I can use these square brackets to reference a dynamic parameter. And so I could just then directly hit something like user 32. That's going to come back with the ID. So I could even access that in my file using get router param. So something like this, get router param. And that's what I'm looking for, the ID value. And we could actually just return that like this. So we should be able then to hit user 32, and we're getting that 32 come back, or 323, or foo, or anything like that. Most features that Nitro offers in terms of server roots and things you might want to do in an API are going to be exposed to you via these auto-imported composables. One of the benefits of doing it that way is that you still get full type safety, but features that you use that aren't features that you don't use won't be included in your application in your server bundle. In this case, we're using getRouterParam, but we're not using stuff like getRouterParams, plural. There are other options. You can do things like set header, set response header, response status, or we could also get cookie values and query values and request host and IP and path protocol, and lots of options available to you in terms of things that will be auto-imported and available in your server routes. I want to highlight two other kinds of routes that we have access to in the server directory. So one is the folder routes. And basically anything in here is going to be directly turned into an endpoint. We'll just say, here we go. And this isn't going to have that API prefix. This is just going to be called page. So if we were to hit this endpoint just at page, then we're getting the response directly like that. So that's probably what you would expect. We can also create a middleware folder. And in the middleware folder are handlers that we want to run on every request. So in this case, they shouldn't return a response because these aren't meant to handle requests. They're meant to do something. Maybe it's going to validate whether this is an allowable request. So for example, in this case, we might do something like const token is get cookie. We're going to get the event and we're going to check if there's a token. And if token is high, then I'm going to want to, maybe if it isn't high, then I'm going to want to create error, status code 401, and say you're not authenticated. And in most cases, of course, this isn't going. We don't want to throw the error, but this is going to apply to every single request to the API. So you have to be careful. You should probably add a little bit more checking here. So we'd want to say something like if event path starts with auth and token doesn't equal, something like that. So we would then be able to hit our page route, and that's going to be fine. We'll say if it starts with user. There we go. But now if we're going to hit our API user endpoint, then we would expect to get an error, and it's going to be this 401 unauthorized. The stack is only in development mode, and that's going to include an HTML string of the stack trace. But you should be able to see that this isn't allowing us to access this unless we were to set something like, what did I set it? Token high. Then we are able to go through correctly. So you might want to use middleware for something like authentication, or you can also set some values on a shared context. So there is this event context that exists. And there are a few things that are available there for you. And you can also set your own. So you might want to do something like event context user is going to be ID. Hi. You'll probably get that in some other way. You might fetch something. But that isn't actually going to come back in any way from a response, but it's going to be accessible elsewhere. So if you then wanted to access the context here, we're just going to pull and place it in there, and you should be able to see that our response now is going to include the context data that we've set for ourselves in the middleware. There are other things that you can do with API routes in Nuxt. So again, I always recommend checking out the documentation. It's a good place to start, of course. And some of the things that we're talking about today are already there. So we've just covered routing. So how you create routes using the page conventions. We also have a storage layer, which is definitely something that you might want to use. Now, the storage layer is a universal key value storage with lots of different drivers. So you can configure that in the Nitro section of your Nuxt config, and you see that you can configure different drivers here. So you could say any kind, so for example, you might have a cache value, and you're going to pick a driver for it. And so you might, for example, in development, pick one thing, and in production, pick another. So in this case, we might say it's going to be memory in development, but maybe in production, we want it to be different. So we might use this special production helper in our Nuxt config to specify a different value in production. So we could do something like this. Driver is going to be, Redis, and you might have to configure some other options for that driver. And you can see the details if you have a look in the documentation. In this case, we need to pass a base, a host, and port at a minimum. Here's an example of what that would look like in our configuration. So, but in this particular case, we could try instead, just for simplicity, to actually use a file system driver for our cache. And we're going to actually have it's going to be base. We're just going to call it cache. And now if in our page, we are going to be able to access that. So we might do something like this. So we access this storage layer with use storage, and that's going to give us a number of helpful utilities to do something. So in this case, we might particularly want to say we are going to set an item, and we're going to set this token to high. It's async, so we await it. And now every single request, it's going to set that token. And we should probably set it in cache, we called it. So we'll call it cache token. And now when we perform a request, it's going to go through, and we should find that, I think I might need to update my pages. Base is cache, drive of fs. Let's try another one, user cache. Yeah, users might be a bit nicer. Let's try user token. Yeah, so you see we now have this cache directory created, and there we have the value for that token. And again, you probably would like to do something like this. So something like const storage is use storage. We can actually pass pre-configured, can actually pre-configure it to access this user's prefix, and then do something like this. So if not storage has item token, so or if storage has item token, then we can actually directly use it here. Otherwise, we could do something to fetch it. So maybe perform some async operation to get the token or whatever. So that all would be possible. So in this case, we could just set it. So we'd say storage, set item token, and we'll say new token. That shouldn't do anything because we already have it. But if we were going to do this in every case, we could simply do it something like this, and we should see that the token has been updated. Now, the great thing about this is that this is allowing us to read and write to the file system here without any configuration on our part or access to node APIs, for example, in our middleware. And it actually means that we can do a lot of very, very useful tricks with Nitro. So in this case, we're using file system. But again, I mentioned we could drop that and instead have memory. And that's all the change that we would need to make. We could delete this cache folder. And actually now, when we hit that endpoint, it's not going to write to the file system. The behavior is going to be exactly the same, but we're going to use this in-memory cache. And then there are lots of other drivers that you could use and configure based on your needs. You can even do it at runtime. You could do something like this. You could do something like storage mount, and actually mount a particular prefix. So we could have our user's cache, and then we can pass a driver. There are lots of them available in unimport. So unstorage rather. So we have got our drivers, and we can ping in Mongo, overlay, planet scale, Redis, etc. And a lot of these actually can be created by yourself. So if we were to look at them, if you want to see the source code of a driver within Nitro. So you simply use the define driver utility that Nitro exposes, and you pass it an object with a setup function. You pass it a setup function which returns an object which has a number of properties. It's all you need to do to create your own unstorage driver if you needed to. And so you could do that programmatically at runtime. One project I would advise you check out if you want to is Elk Zone. So Elk is a client for Mastodon, which is a distributed social network, and it's built in Nuxt, and it's also open source. So you can have a look and see all of the details of how a lot of things are implemented. In this case, there are server endpoints, and you can, for example, we have a custom cache driver for unstorage. You can check out a number of other utilities like this shared util, where we mount different drivers based on configuration that's passed to the project. And that's useful because it allows us to have people clone Elk and publish it to their own accounts with perhaps different configuration. They might want to use a file system or Cloudflare or memory or something else. So that all works quite well. There's more to talk about in terms of Nuxt. So and server roots. One thing that you might find pretty quickly as you're writing your roots is that you might want to add some headers to them, or handle cores or something like that. And Nuxt provides a very powerful way of doing that. So in this case, we might say all of our API roots, we want to apply some root rules to them. So we could do that like this. By default, we could handle cross-origin requests. So now when we hit our API endpoint there, we're just going to hit our, I think we can probably ignore this, the error code just for now, so that we can hit it in a more simple way. And hit user Bob. And you'll see that we now have access control, allow headers, and max age, and so on, which should mean that now you might be able to access this with another application running on a different domain. There are other kinds of root rules that you can apply as well. So you might find, for example, that you want to pre-render some of your API responses. So what we could do is something like this. We have our user, and we might say, Bob, we can actually pre-render this particular API response. Or you might instead, if you're using Vercel or Netlify, we could actually just use incremental static regeneration to render it once when requested, and then after that we don't hit the server endpoint, we just use the pre-rendered response. So you might do that instead. There are other options in terms of things we can do. So we also created a page. So you might do something here where we're going to add some headers to it, for example. You could pass any custom headers. So we'd say X hackathon true. And now if we hit that page endpoint, we're actually going to see that we have the header automatically set for us in the response. And there are many, many, many more options that you can have. Some of these are specific to Nuxt, and some of them are Nitro related. So we have the possibility of a redirect. We have the possibility of proxying entire endpoints. So there's lots and lots of things you can do with root rules. I'd also like to cover another very, very useful thing that you can do in your server roots. There's quite a powerful session support in Nitro. So you can do something like this. Const session is await get session event. And we have to pass some options here. So a session requires a password because it's going to create an encrypted session for us. So I'm going to create a random password here. And the session allows us to do a number of things. We can access some data, for example. We can set that data, and the data will persist across requests. So if I wanted, for example, to set the user context here based on session data, we could do something like this. We have our session. We're going to set our user context to session data. And we are going to, if session data, So if we don't have a user ID here, then we're going to set one. So we're going to set, and we're going to take it from the user ID just so, or we'll take it from a header maybe. I just want to show you that it's working. So we could do something like session update session, update session event, and then we're going to pass some data in here. We'll say, we need to keep the password like this. And now we're going to set the ID. So we're going to set the ID to be get header, and we'll just use this X user ID, which is perfectly good, okay? And we're going to, again, I think in our user ID here, we are passing in the context. So we'll just say session ID. So what we expect to see here is if I perform a request now with this X user ID header set, so I'll say something like Daniel, and that response is going to come back with the session ID correctly set to Daniel. You should also see that we have we have to await it. That's an easy mistake to make. You should also see that what we have is this big cookie, which is an encrypted cookie and contains the information about the session here. So what we're doing, of course, is that we have this header coming back. Now, obviously, when we're performing a request from the browser, that header is going to be passed automatically, but I'll have to do it manually just for here. So I'm going to drop out the user ID header, and instead we're going to set the cookie header. So now, when I perform that request, I'm going to have to put it in quotes because there we go. So even though now I'm not passing my session ID, my user ID specifically, it's reading it correctly from the cookie. This session support is really, really useful, particularly when you start to do any kind of authentication in your Nuxt. There are some other really useful things that you might want to do, and caching is one of them. So particularly when you find you're doing something which is not dependent on state or authentication, you might want to cache the result of it to avoid pummeling or hitting a rate limit or something like that. And actually we have a utility called define cached event handler, which allows you to do exactly that. So you just replace define event handler with define cached event handler, and you can specify some cache options then in the response. You can specify where it gets stored. So again, using the storage API, if you had a custom prefix, you could do that. You can customize the max age of the response. You can customize whether it's going to whether you're going to use a stale while revalidate strategy to respond, which is often very good because it means even if you're not caching it for very long, you can dramatically improve response times. So let's just explore what that would look like here. So we'll set it in this case to a small value, or we'll just enable it here, and we'll have a long response. So something like await new promise, set timeout. So it's going to take a minimum of 1 second. And let's just remove the cache, and I want to show you that is what's going to happen. So if we hit this endpoint, we should see a long response, and then we get our request. And actually, I can drop any headers at this point. You can just see it's going to take a second every time. I could make that even more dramatic and make it take 5 seconds. Long delay. If you have an API like this that is taking a long time because you're hitting it and you don't really have a choice, you can't control it. Again, define cached event handler is probably going to be your friend. So just enabling SWR true on it will immediately help. So now we're going to hit it. It's going to take a long time. It's the first time. But subsequently, you're going to be able to get instantaneous responses because it's going to serve the existing response, and in the background, it will revalidate it for you. So that's basically an immediate performance win that you can opt into. You could also do something very similar using root rules. You could enable SWR there like this, and that might be easier. But using cached event handler allows you to have fine-grained control of the cache in relation to each endpoint. There's some other things perhaps that might be useful to know in relation to API routes in Nuxt. So one, and maybe one of the most powerful things, is that you get typed access to them. So you can use this $fetch function, and you actually can see the different endpoints in this case. And we actually know what the response is going to be. In this case, it's going to be a string. And we have access to that data by making this $fetch call. When you use $fetch, it within the server, it actually doesn't hit the network layer at all. It will just directly execute the API route as though it's a function, which is, again, incredibly useful and powerful within a Nuxt application. So it means that we don't have to actually, in a serverless function context, it means we don't have the overhead of initializing a new request, sending it out, invoking a new serverless function, and then getting the response back. It all happens in the same request as fast as we possibly can. So that's quite a useful thing to be able to do. There are some other things I think that we could say. Nuxt allows us to return strings and objects. It also, if you want to return a 204 response, you can just return null. So if we hit our page here, you'll get a 204 no content response, which is, again, what you might expect. I gave an example of throwing an error. So you can do that at any point. So you could do something like throw create error, and you can pass a number of useful features there, but status code is probably the one you're going to want to send. So in this case, it's a 404. If we hit that endpoint, we'll get a 404 response, and it will tell us that that page is not found. And you can, of course, do that conditionally. So that's a very useful thing to be able to do. A couple of other features that you might want to know about. You can append a request method. So you could do something like page.get. And that means that now this is accessible only through a GET request. But if we were to post to it, for example, it's actually not going to match at all. And this is the default Nuxt application page because it's not matching this route. It's going to fall through and Nuxt will render the app for us. You can also, if you prefer to handle things a little bit more manually, you can use the assert method function within your page. So you could say it's got to be a get or a post request. In this case, we should still get a response for our post request. But if we were to take, say, a patch, it's now going to throw an error and say it's a 405. HTTP method is not allowed. So that might be a useful thing to be able to do. There are lots of other things that you would maybe potentially want to do in a Nuxt application inside your API routes. But one of the things you're going to want to ask and figure out is, how do I use this in my Nuxt app? And Nuxt gives you a couple of ways of actually using API requests inside your application. So to start with, you can actually just directly request it. So you could fetch, say, we're going to fetch our page. What am I returning here? Nothing. So let's make it a little bit more interesting. I guess we can use our user ID endpoint. We will fetch API user Bob. Okay, so you can directly get the data here, and we can actually just render it in the page like that. And so we would actually access just, say, the ID. And if we were to fetch our home page, you should see that we've got, alongside some script stuff, we have our ID Bob in the page as we would expect. A lot of this, by the way, is to power dev tools and allow you to get direct click access when you're editing, when you're using your website. But what you would find is that our Nuxt app is going to perform a request on the client side as well as the server. So we would have a request for Bob. And the problem with that is that, we're getting it on the server to render the HTML, so why do we need to re-request on the client? And the answer is really we shouldn't. So Nuxt provides a composable called useFetch, which is just pretty much exactly the same as this one, except that it's going to handle the case for us of fetching the data and hydrating it on our client. In this case, it's letting us know it could be null if there's an error or something. So we will just want to handle that there. Now, if we perform a request, we don't have any extra client-side request. It just uses the data that came back on the server. And you can actually see that data here in our rendered HTML. We actually have this value directly passed in. So this is a little bit of a complex rendering of JSON, but allows us to have deeply interactive objects. So in this case, we can use view reactive objects, and we can also use just normal JSON. We could even use things like timestamps and other kinds of things. But yes, you can use your API route just using useFetch. It allows you to pass all the options that you normally might to a fetch request, including different headers, or you can specify that something shouldn't be executed immediately. So, but only on request. So we might, for example, have something like this. Let's see, unmounted. We're going to set a timeout and call refresh 1 second, say 2 seconds after load. So then we would expect to load the page with no data, and then 2 seconds later we load it for us. And there are lots of other features that you can access there. If you haven't checked them out, the Nuxt docs are a very good place to start. So you could find out some information about data fetching and what it does and how it works. And you can see some code examples, and there's even more information in the dedicated API docs for each of these Nuxt composables. Probably useFetch is the one you're going to want to check out to start with. There's a lot of stuff there that might be useful. Well, there are very few things about creating API routes in Nuxt, and I hope that's going to get you started in building apps that are full stack and use best practices for modern serverless or serverful web apps. Please feel free to get in contact if I can help you with anything. I have a website, which is roe.dev. You can check it out. In particular, if you want to get in contact with me, you're very welcome to do that, particularly if getting started in open source is something that you might want to try. And if you maybe lack experience or feel that your background puts you at a disadvantage, then let me know. I'd love to talk. And you can book a call with me anytime. I hope it's been helpful today, and I can't wait to see some of what you create as part of this hackathon.